welcome to our session on counterframing the new economy. Just checking my mute button isn't on now. Okay, good. I'm Pandora Syperek, and I'm a research associate on the project Counterframing Design, which is an AHRC funded research project based in the Institute for Design Innovation at Loughborough University, London. And the goal of the project is to understand the relationship between socio-political framing and strategic action in the field of sustainability to develop a novel design approach to support design for social change theory and practice. And the principal investigator on the project is my colleague, Sharon Prendeville, who I'll pass it over to now.
Yeah, thanks a million, Pandora. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I think we're just gonna, what we're talking about today is very much work in progress. So we're kind of at the developmental stage of ideas. So some stuff is a bit tentative. So I think just kind of setting the tone for the discussion of work in progress concepts and ideas that we're going to share. Yeah, so I mean, frames, just to kind of initiate into kind of frame theory from maybe, communication studies, more critical realms of communication studies, which has been very prevalent in the sustainability debates over the last few years. So what is a frame? It's a statement: the free market, tax relief, law and order, climate change. And obviously over the last kind of number of years, we've seen the interrogation of some of these to a greater or lesser extent through social movements. So when we think about frames, we can think about them in very simple terms. A frame is a take on a particular social issue, to frames being the surface effects that are rooted in our value systems. This is Frederick Jameson's critique in response to Goffman's original conception of frame theory in communication studies. More kind of substantively, frames and their associated counterframes are part of social processes. Public debate happens through the unfolding of different frame positions, their interaction and their relation, and their kind of co-formation and co-evolution in processes of change. And importantly, frames are determined and enacted through socio-material relations and practices. So it's not just a it's just not just a linguistic component to frames, and this is an important entry point for design. So, I mean, some of the critiques, this is kind of quite an old slide, but some of the critiques that kind of laid the basis of the original, AHRC proposal through which we won the funding is based on, the critiques of frame theory from critical theory, really. The idea that frames are semiotic front, they're a level above, they're representative of these types of surface effects. The interrogation of what we call institutionalized frames, taken for granted frames, or naturalized frames, such as those ones I just mentioned, the free market, tax relief, law and order, climate change. It's very obvious to us when we put this down on paper. Law and order, defund the police seemed like such a kind of a preposterous proposition probably 5 to 10 years ago, but now it's part of public discourse, and this is how frames change and unfold. Climate change obviously has been dealt with quite well in the sustainability community, transitioning the framing of climate change as something that is just kind of a force of nature, a slow and natural process, to climate emergency or climate action, and the need for mobilization around that. Similarly, the free market as a force of nature, tackling that as the free market is actually a social construction, which is kind of the substance of some of the follow-up discussion here. And why this is important from a design perspective, if you look at design theory on frames, which is substantively written about by Kees Dorst, the distinction between frame theory from social movement studies, from political theory, in correspondence with design frames, there is quite a significant distinction. So again, it's just understanding the entry points for design. How can we deal better with some of these design frames through, you know, socio-political conceptions of frame theory? Pandora, you're going to talk about this?
Yeah. So I'll just sum up a bit what we've been looking at within the project. So we've been researching the field of new economics in quite a broad way through interviews and discourse analysis. So looking at grassroots organizations from climate campaigning groups like Extinction Rebellion, the Creative Commons, peer-to-peer, solidarity economy, just transitions movements, issues groups working around universal basic income, community land trusts, sustainable arts and culture organizations and curatorial collectives, the right to repair movement. And within these groups, within interviews and reading their reports, various forms of literature. Oh, I was going to try and, I'm not sure if I can take over. We can look at the next slide, I think, so, Sharon. We've been uncovering the frames that are coming out of this discourse, the frames and the emerging counter frames. So here you see they're sort of grouped in these loose, what we've been awkwardly calling frame clusters. So, they're, in a way, they're sort of endless frames that are emerging, but these are the ones that we see recurring from sort of more dominant frames, such as the idea of the Green New Deal, Build Back Better, which has subsequently became Joe Biden's campaign slogan. The heavily contested idea of the new normal, but that's definitely a frame that a lot of these groups have been questioning, at least. The sort of old school concept of people and planet, to sort of more countering frames around the commons, degrowth, post-growth, just transitions, ideas around land stewardship, climate justice, the more intersectional ideas that see social justice and climate as inextricably intertwined, ideas around decolonizing and indigenous perspectives, which we'll come back to a bit later. And I guess more sort of academic concepts such as multi-species, the Anthropocene becoming, these are all coming into more common usage. And then sort of more fringe ideas such as deep adaptation, the idea of societal collapse, what Michael Mann has called doomism, also known as collapsology, and then on the flip side of that, more hopeful frames around restoration, reconciliation, and ethics of care. And then other sort of outlying frames such as, the tech solutions, eco-modernism, the frame of climate migration. So these are all, as you can see, interconnected. They all connect to each other, but there's also a lot of conflict coming within. So that's, between these frames and also within the individual frames. So that's what we're interested in uncovering, in looking at a bit, and how they work alongside each other and evolve. I think we can move on from this unless you have something to say, Sharon. Oh.
Great, thanks a million. I guess why frames or counter frames are important is they deal with the question of mental models of what the possibilities are within, society. But I mean, from in counterframing, we are interested in, you know, the relationship between norms, challenging norms that are made through practices that build institutions, and then the corresponding relationship with the mental models that underpin, you know, our ideas of the economy. Just drawing on the work of Catherine Bohm from Gibson Graham's collective. So, I mean, this is kind of like what we want to do on the surface when we're, you know, challenging, you know, naturalized understandings of what economic possibilities are. At the surface level, you know, the proposition of an alternative way of doing things, a new norm, is oftentimes, if we take commons as a component of new economy, you know, there are certain perceptions of commons, such as related to like tinkering or unseriousness, or you know, the the commons is not really the real economy. The real economy is out there. And there's perception of a certain sense of folly or foolishness associated with these types of practices. So this, you know, rehabilitating this kind of foolishness is an intention of counterframing. Similarly, the taken-for-grantedness of mental models, so the commonsensical understanding of what the economy is equally needed to, you know, is something we need to interrogate. So what we want to do is kind of flip these things to a degree. So what is ostensibly foolish or folly can become taken for granted, and what was previously taken for granted can be seen as contestable. In order to do that, and there's some, you know, obviously some very important work done on this area already by you know, many people in terms of interrogating the relationship between nature and society. If you want to deal with mental models, this is the kind of, you know, the questions you need to ask, you know, questions about limits, crises, people, planet, nature, society, or, you know, the various iterations of these types of relationships, or the triangulation of market, society, ecology. And as I say, there's, you know, important work done in this area to subvert understandings of the relationships between these components. So Ethan Miller calls the kind of the constitutional trio of sustainability discourse as, you know, ecology or environment, or market economy, or society and place. And typically these kind of three components are represented in three of a variety of different ways. You know, intersecting circles, triangulation or a pyramid, or the nested sandwich, sorry, just a sandwich, or the nested spheres. And this is kind of, it's a substantive point of the talk today. So this kind of builds on the Polanyian conception of embededdness. So if we take the free market as something unembedded outside of society, what Polanyi's argumentation around embededdness did was to conceptually move the economy to become part of society. So we have a continuum from unembedded to embedded, where we have a dualistic relationship between market society. At one end of the continuum, market is unembedded. And then we move that dualism to the other end of the continuum to make the market, to embed the market in society, but yet sustaining the dualistic relationship. What Ethan Miller proposes is that we then integrate the conception of ecology environment and triangulate the relationship between the three, but sustain a series of dualisms within the triangulation. So we can elaborate a little bit on this. So this is what we call, this is obviously Kate Raworth's embedded economy, which is building in this concept of the embeddedness of the economy in society and environment. And she actually uses Polanyi's terminology, and the title of the diagram is embedded economy. There's a reference missing there, I can add it afterwards if we circulate them. And I want to say, like, straight up, I think, you know, I'm a big admirer of Kate Raworth, and she's written about one of my other projects in her book, Open Source Circular Economy. She uses it as one of her case studies in donut economics. So I think, you know, and what I like about what she has done is this kind of level of additional granularity within the dimension of economy, you know, distinguishing that according to household, common, state, and market. But if we, similarly, we see maybe the perpetuation or the continuation of a certain dualistic relationship between market society, evident in some new economic practice. So the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the conversation about the need to rethink capitalism and its supporting economic structures. Much less attention has been directed to reinvent our social systems, illustratively. I just want to like divert slightly to this concept of frame backlash before I come back to some of the kind of problem, the concerns, I suppose, about the concept of embededdness from heterodox economists that are somewhat critical of that view. So in social movement theory, communication studies, cognitive psychology that develop these concepts of frame theory, essentially. You know, frames are understood to be more or less effective. Frames can fail, frames can, you know, frames work in cycles. Frames that were emergent some time ago, you know, 2 decades ago, can re-emerge over time for varieties of reasons. So a good example is the UN's use of, like very intentional use of the climate refugee as the face of climate change. So that was like a very intentional communication strategy used by the United Nations. There's a really good talk about it by a frame specialist. And, you know, what happened with this is that it played into public, you know, slightly, very hysterical public discourse about, you know, the hordes of people at the gates, which we saw play out in Brexit. But then similarly, it plays into, you know, the kind of the new movement of eco-authoritarianism. So you can read about that by, you know, the recent publication by Sharon, 2015. Who writes about cycles of eco-authoritarianism. So this is about intentionality of frames. Frames have historical cycles. They may have, you know, a slightly different quality, but they do appear, disappear, and reappear. And they also backfire or backlash. So I guess, I mean, does the concept of embeddedness within some new economic frames that we're looking at risk some sort of frame backlash? Is that a possibility? And this is building on the work of very famous heterodox economist Jeff Hodgson, who is one of my colleagues at Loughborough University of London, Matt Vidal, who is a reader in Marxism, and Greta Krippner, she's a American political economist. So what their critique of Polanyi's embeddedness is about is that it takes the asocial market construct in social relations, all the while preserving intact the notion that somewhere there was a hard core of market behavior existing outside of social life, and hence needed to be embedded. So the fluid mixing of social objects in a way that defied disciplinary boundaries, but rather the concept was used to envelop and submerge the asocial market construct in social relations, all the while preserving intact the notion that somewhere there was a hard core of market behavior existing outside of the life of the social. I realize it's a repeated quote, but you get the idea. Yeah. Similarly, I mean, you know, markets are formed through, as Polanyi emphasizes, you know, they represent a complex alchemy of politics, culture, and ideology. Similarly, every transaction, no matter how instantaneous, is social in the broader sense of the term. Congealed into every market exchange is a history of struggle and contestation that has produced actors with certain understandings of themselves and the world that predispose them to exchange under a certain set of social rules and not another. In this sense, the state, culture, and politics are contained in every market act. They do not invariably exert their influence on some kinds of markets more than others. So, I mean, to kind of generalize some of the critiques of embeddedness that we can see in the works of heterodox economists, such as Krippner, Hodgson, is that there's a kind of a hard boundary sustained in the concept of embeddedness. And that actually the dualistic relationship between market and social is sustained. The market remains as an object, a fixed entity, and that they are essentially separate, the internal dynamics of which are still impenetrable. So some challenges to this are to try to think of more polymorphic models that could subsequently interrogate those representations further. So in a recent study by the Framing the Economy, which is funded by NEON, which is New Economy Organizers Network, and NEF, they identify this cognitive whole as one of the kind of things that needs to be interrogated in UK kind of public consciousness about what the economy is. So this cognitive whole, while people had some limited ways of understanding the economy, many mechanisms of the economy remain in a black box, seen as being governed by mysterious market forces. So one of the findings of their study is that we need new frames, new metaphors, and alternative stories to try to deconstruct this kind of conception of the black box. Similarly, a scholar called Bruck, I need to add a few references here, building on the work of Greta Krippner, talks about, they problematize this hard boundary, is talking about like low marketness. What's the marketiness versus high marketness? Neil Fligstein, whose work we use in the project quite substantively, he's a political economist at Princeton, uses conceptions of fields. So force fields as representative of social forces at work within the economy. And at the basis of Fligstein's model is the conception of power dynamics. It's a meso-level theory that integrates between micro and macro. So he's very interested in the relationships and activities and practices between government institutions and publics that actually make the economy. So we might think about low marketness, high marketness, or the market in formation or formed, if we think about market as emergent in Fligstein's conception. From one of our interviews, we see, maybe an illustrative example of this. Okay, let's set up this network and then we can share our work, because also a lot of the other co-ops in the network weren't paying themselves as much as we were paying ourselves, or we're in a bit more of a precarious situation. So that's when CoTech started. It's the making of institutions illustratively, new institutions that support cooperativism. Similarly, I mean, the work of the social solidarity economy builds on Rianne Eisler's work from The Real Wealth of Nations, building in kind of conceptions of partnership systems using this kind of polymorphic approach. We might think about the work of Suzanne O'Donovan, whose performative assemblages. She's an architecture practice using non-hierarchical, non-linear presentation of proposed socio-economic programs and ecological interventions. I mean, I'm just going to go through these a little bit quickly because they are just very illustrative. And similarly, Ethan Miller's follow-up work, which she did, some of which she did with Gibson Graham, is the ecological livelihoods concept. So making a living for ourselves, making a living for others, and then being made by others. And so this lattice network or cell structure as a kind of representative of the economy. So the kind of other conception that comes through in New Economy critique or reformation, of course, is Homo economicus, rational man, who is under-socialized. And the counterpoint to rational man is proposed by Hilary Cottam is sapiens integra, who is a social being motivated to belong to social groups, to develop shared understandings, to control their interpersonal outcomes effectively, and to enhance themselves and to trust others by default. And again, we're dealing with two ends of a spectrum. I mean, I'm a bit hesitant about this point because it's not, I mean, yeah, I'll just go for it and we can talk about it. So like Homo economicus at one end of the spectrum versus Sapiens integra at the other. And this is also spoken about and written about by heterodox economists, 20, 30 years ago, in terms of the under-socialized, over-socialized ends of the spectrum. I mean, like the idea of an over-socialized Sapiens integra is obviously, tautologist and fallacious, so I don't actually totally endorse this point. It's work in progress. But what is important about it is that there are degrees of resonance of frames depending on your value systems. And this is, of course, the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who, like set out the kind of aesthetic representations of different spheres of society through his work in Distinction. This is actually one of Bourdieu's drawings. If you see in the center, cadre public is the public frame, cadre privé is the private frame. And he's talking about the material representations of different spheres of the public. And this is important for how we kind of frame sustainability in relation to action, if we go back to the kind of start of the presentation, because the degree to which we can resonate with the sensibility of different social groups, is essential to understand well in order to be able to, engage them in some sort of social action. So we can think about this in terms of resonance or friction. And again, if we come back to the commons, we can think about aesthetic friction. And aesthetic friction is obviously, there are certain kind of particular characteristics of certain alternative production communities that are not universally, appealing. So there is a balance with friction. It challenges our, taken-for-grantedness. It can challenge our, institutionalized aesthetic sensibilities. But if we, think about, action and the time frame that we need action to kind of happen, we need to think about these things very, very carefully, essentially. Yeah, I'll let Pandora talk about the next few slides, and then hopefully we have time for some discussion.
Yeah, I'll try and do this quickly, but we just thought we'd bring in a sort of case study as an example, sort of bringing together some of these ideas. So it's a project by Dark Matter Labs called Property Rights, Property Wrongs, Micro Treaties with the Earth. And it's quite a complex work, actually. So I'm afraid I'm not going to completely do it justice, but as you can see, they're starting with a critique of the Western default model of economics, and particularly they're looking at the role of law. So in which various aspects, the individual, the rule of law, the government, the sovereign, are all discrete and autonomous and compartmentalized. And this idea that Earth is the background against which humans live out history. And looking at decentering that Western model. And the examples they bring in are community land trusts and the rights of nature movement. So, I mean, ultimately, this is a critique of private land ownership, and which I see as a legacy of colonialism. And they, as an alternative, they're proposing law as a verb and a communal practice, or maybe a communal practice, which can lead to reconciliation. Because so they're working. Sharon, do you mind going to the next slide, please? So this project is working with Nouveau Voisin, which is a local nonprofit organization based in Montreal, with the express goal of de-lawning. So their slogan is less lawn, more biodiversity. And this project, they're bringing in Indigenous knowledge to consider how to rewild urban spaces. So the rights of nature has been quite prevalent recently with the granting of natural features as persons with personhood. So there's the Wangani River in New Zealand. I think just recently there was another river in Canada, actually in Quebec, that was granted personhood. So there are these other examples like Erie, in the States, Ecuador, New Zealand. But they're looking at this very sort of local and private sphere. So again, you have this sort of scalar thing going on, thinking about how lawns can be transformed and rewilded. And so they call this micro treaties with the earth. And I think, so, the treaty being an important and, having a very contested history within Canadian and Indigenous history, but looking at this in the relationship to the land rather than just within human groups. So I think they're really successfully connecting these colonial legacies to climate legacies. But there's also this challenge of the aesthetics of rewilding or de-lawning, and they acknowledge this. So, I mean, many Canadians, whether settlers, immigrants, or First Nations people, uphold the aesthetic ideal of the mown, tidy lawn as beautiful. And so these socio-economic, cultural contingencies of aesthetics need to be factored in. And Dark Matter Labs in this project with Nouveau Voisin is looking at sort of how to unite the scientific knowledge of ecology, biodiversity with Indigenous worldviews of interconnectivity. And their approach is really through law, though a sort of expanded sense of law, and reconsidering what property is. So, I mean, it can be seen as a sort of form of eco-commoning. Sharon, could you go to the next slide, please? So, I mean, this relates to this idea of the aesthetics of the new economy or of commons, and issues of inclusivity. So the idea of the commons as an enclosure. And I mean, I think this is really complex because it's also this issue of, well, it's private ownership and property and what that means. So I just put in this example fairly recently where a couple in Quebec were having a legal battle with the municipal government over their lawn being overgrown, and they're saying, well, it's not a lawn, it's a wildflower meadow. And I guess this brings up this idea of sort of who the aesthetics of the commons are aimed at and how you overturn these norms. So yeah, and again, their approach here is by changing the norms through law. So, I mean, a legal battle like this sort of points towards how, if lawns don't have the regulation on them, but in fact, there are laws demanding a certain amount of wildlife built into a garden, that will then have a sort of that will overturn the aesthetic norms within society. But this also relates to other communal spaces, which are often, or aesthetics of the commons, which are often criticized for being exclusive. So whether it's, white, male, and I guess can we just go to the next slide, Sharon? Oh yeah, another example that I thought we'd bring in, but we're really interested to hear from other people about other examples. I can think of these sorts of aesthetic tensions. Extinction Rebellion, which I mean, again, has been criticized for being exclusive in a variety of ways, but we're interested in them because they're bringing, they deploy design and aesthetics in such an effective, I mean, it's been an incredibly effective way. So whether it's their logo and through various techniques, so embodiment, people performing a die-in under the blue whale skeleton at the Natural History Museum, the Red Brigade, you know, using these very sort of accessible, but very aesthetically impactful methods to achieve their aims, and working within this decentralized governance model, to the much smaller gestures like visible mending. Maybe we can go to the next slide, Sharon. So I mean, these all speak to these aesthetic dimensions of norm making and norm unmaking. So how socio-material practices can make or unmake frames. So we've set up a Miro board, which people are welcome to write, to add to. Sharon's put it in the chat. But also, we'd really just like to hear from people if you want to, if you have other examples of these types of aesthetics, aesthetic tensions. And I mean, I put possible solutions there, but I think solutions isn't the right word, but how to navigate these types of practices and how they're put into practice.
Cool. I can stop sharing now, if that helps to have a chat. Reshare the mural in case it didn't come through for everyone who shared it at the beginning.
I just want to say thank you, Sharon and Pandora, first of all, for that talk, which is really enjoyable and kind of dense in a good way. As in, I've basically made a load of notes and I don't even know where to start on the stuff that I've written down, because there's so many things that came up, both just as other themes that we've explored and kind of the relationship with those. I think there's a whole thing here around just perceptions of what the economy is on just a very simple level, which is huge at the moment. So we were talking about things like modern monetary theory on a session earlier. Sharon says my sound isn't very good. Anyway, I'm going to just pass it over to other people just to have that conversation.
I have a better appreciation for the awkward silence after other presentations. There's so much. I'm like, okay, there's so much to talk about. But I'll ask one question. I was thinking I have a few references around, particularly around how people think about the economy. I've been focusing on the imaginary, and so I guess I'll start with a question and skip all the commentary. As I'm newer into entering, that discussion. So I've been focusing on the economic imaginary as a way of modeling how, of how people think about the economy, what it is, and how that is manifest in objects and how it's in design. How do you compare, reframing and framing versus the imaginary or their relationship?
Hi, Justin. Thanks for the question. I mean, there are debates about the, the distinction between frames and discourses, for example, the difference between frames and ideology. I mean, I think, I guess from social movements and critical communication study, I think we can have a very clear distinction between, intentional frame theory, so frames that are put out to, very actively and purposefully and intentionally contest kind of naturalized conceptions of the social order, such as the existence of the police. I think this is, when you move from that end of understanding of frames to the concept of institutionalized frames or naturalized frames, I think things become a lot muddier in terms of conceptual clarity in relation to frames, ideology, discourse. But I mean, in the terms of the imaginary, I guess I haven't reflected on that so much. I think it's a good question. What do you think?
It was me really kind of cheating and asking like, well, as I embark on understanding the imaginary, I hadn't read as much about frames. And I think you had a nice distinction about, because there's this simple version of the frames, which is kind of the everyday, how we kind of frame issues like climate, tax relief versus tax justice. But then when we get into frames within frames, it starts to sound very similar to me about the discussion for imaginaries, which kind of imaginaries embody both they embody discourse and practice and ideology, and they're all kind of operating interacting with each other. And I don't know enough about frames to. I was going to say, are frames maybe a manifestation of the imaginary? But that's also because I learned about the imaginary first, so perhaps I'm seeing it as that. And it might be that imaginaries are a manifestation of frames, or maybe they're the same thing but just talked about in different ways from different fields.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to ask you about the kind of materialist dimension of the conception of the imaginary, because I mean, this is something I struggled a lot with frame theory initially, and I think it can be again maybe like a theoretical possibility for design, because design is material practice. And I mean, this is Frederick Jameson's position on frames. The other thing I was going to just quickly, reflect on in relation to your question was that, I mean, to what extent is the concept of the imaginary utilitarian? Like, to what extent can it be leveraged as a kind of a social action tool? Is maybe where things become distinguishable, but I mean, I would like to discuss it and explore it more.
I think that's great. I'll stop now because other people have questions, but I think you asked what I've been thinking about in particular from my research is, if we were trying to, how does design, you were thinking about points of contestation or depoliticization, if you're trying to create a framework for, okay, well, where does my research actively contest the imaginary? Like, where do you put that in terms of like, okay, we're gonna now contest and attack this term, or try and redefine this term. I don't know enough about framing to think about that, but I think that's if you're engaged in action to intentionally question or contest meaning, how does that situate within the wider context is the question I've had, but I don't have any answers to.
But yeah, I mean, I think like very pragmatically, like if we think, the work on cognitive science done on frame theory is very, it is very pragmatic and again utilitarian, which I think we need to think in time frames. We have certain kind of urgencies to do things within the next decade, as we're all well aware in the room. But like this is why I think I put this binary of Homo economicus versus sapiens integra, and kind of juxtapose that with friction versus resonance, because there are mixed motives, and this is quite clearly shown in the concept of being biconceptual in our positionality, and then making the work on frames, which is really essentialized in the work of Michael Mann, is there is a very clear and kind of demonstrable relationship between frames and action. Yeah, and that's the work done in the Framing the Economy report as well. But I mean, we're trying to kind of distill this into, you know, what is the potentiality for design? Yeah.
Joanna has a hand up.
Thanks for that presentation. Really interesting. I'm like following on Justin's question. It does seem like there's a lot of other concepts, related concepts that are not mentioned and haven't been mentioned. I mean, maybe you mentioned them more widely in your research, but like Justin said, imaginary, but also perspectives, worldview, and probably most important, ideology. And you know, there is a sort of a very distinct anti-ideological current in academia that, like, where this idea of the end of ideology, and it does concern me a little to have frames being used in a way that is so linked to the way that we think of ideology traditionally, and yet not sort of acknowledge the territory of the ideological. And so one way that was kind of I'm not sure, it seemed that, like, I didn't write down the quote that you had about the commons and the enclosure. I think it was something about like the commons being like creating an enclosure, but I mean, traditionally, where the word commons is like the opposite of enclosure. So it's very, I found that quite a strange statement. And potentially what you mean is that the commons has a different sort of aesthetic, because you were talking about it in that sort of, when you were also talking about Bordeaux and aesthetics. But I mean, I think that the way that Bordeaux talked about aesthetic sensibilities and their relationship to class and sociological position and ideology and patriarchy, and so it just seems to me that it's really an essential concept that needs to be included. And I guess the other thing is that when you were talking about the role of laws in changing norms, it's also, I mean, laws are the embodiment of a previous, what you would call frames, but what I might have described as ideological positions or perspectives. It's like our laws are currently anti-ecological and not really enabling sustainability because of a particular perspective. You could call it a frame or an ideology, but I think that I would like to see all of the other terms that are used to understand changing worldviews, like just dismissed just for this new framing. Because I mean, I understand that the importance in the design community to emphasize frames, because we're so involved with framing, that's our practice. But it's very much built on these much more, much bigger social processes that I think are described by terms like ideology in a more in a way that needs to be there as well as frames. I think that's it.
And see, Indy has his hand up. Is that picking up on Joanna, or yeah, go for it.
Sorry, yes, I was just picking up on Joanna, I suppose. I've just come into the conversation, but there was just something very interesting about what you were saying, Joanna. And one of the things that we found, for example, with property rights, right, as an idea, is that it's kind of entangled between language, frame, law, conception, imaginaries. And they're not divisible in a simplistic way to any particular one thesis. It's the entanglement that makes them very difficult. And even the objectiveness of our language structure reinforces that kind of theory of how we see the world and subject-object relationships and how we structure our language. So when you're looking at these entanglements, how do we operate as designers? Feels like one of the problems that we've been dealing with, certainly, where you can't simply say it's frame or law or ideology. These become entangled realities of kind of where we're completely immersed in the system. I'd love your thoughts on that, because just how to deal with that.
Thanks a million, Indy and Joanna. I mean, I think if you look on the Miro board, there's actually a slide there where we talk about ideology. I think it was the third or fourth slide in the presentation, where we explicitly try to, problematize the language of frames. I think the part of the rationale of using and speaking about frames is because it is the language of design, and therefore it opens up the potential for, deconstructing actually what frames are in material, terms. So, I mean, this is very much built into, the work that we're doing to, politicize the conception of frames, to problematize it, to, reflect back on the design community, the kind of the superficiality implicit in the way in which design talks about design frames. So, I mean, I would just say that, I think it's obviously very, much part of our thinking. I mean, I think maybe today we were kind of keen to try to focus a little bit on some other aspects of the project, of course. I mean, as well in social movement theory, when we had things about like frame failure. So frames very much in the communicative understanding of the word. This very much speaks to ideological positions, the degree to which these work or don't work, the way in which they reappear and reappear over cycles builds on the work of Stuart Hall, these concepts of emergence. So I think, I mean, I think it's good to hear that it doesn't come through so much in what we discussed today. So I think that's definitely something to reflect on and bring forward. And I think I mean, it's, this entanglement is kind of also what we were trying to kind of convey a little bit through Ethan Miller's work as well. So I think you took the words out of my mouth, so thanks for that. Pandora, do you want to come in on anything there?
I would just add, I mean, to point out other things that we didn't have time to get into much is the distinction between ideology and discourse is also something that we've been thinking about, which is contested in this sort of replacement, as you say, Jan, of this sort of fear of ideology and sort of replacement with the idea of discourse, since Foucault or earlier. So I mean, just that's definitely something that we're aware of in relation and how these things are distinguished, ideology from discourse, from frames. And in terms of the legal framework, I mean, I'm really glad that Indy came in. That was very well timed, because I mean that's really not our focus. But that is the focus of that project. And I mean, as I said, I didn't want to sort of misrepresent or underrepresent it. But I think in many other ways, in terms of the commons and these sort of tensions around aesthetics, that it's a really good example. I mean, it's a fascinating project, and I encourage you all to check it out. But then on like the critique of the commons as an enclosure, I mean, that's a critique, and I mean, yeah, I think we recognize that as a
Can you explain though? Because I've never seen that. I don't really know what you mean, because the commons was like the opposite of the enclosure originally.
But originally.
And it's still I mean, it seems to me like the opposite of an enclosure. Where is this critique of commons as an enclosure?
I think there's a few different points being conflated here. So on the one hand, we're talking about the concept of aesthetic friction being a metaphorical enclosure. So the idea of we need, I can't start another Zoom until this ends.
Oh,
sorry, yeah, I've got,
all right.
got to do another call. Is there anybody here? Mark, anybody? Can you create a Zoom link?
I can't, because I'm literally have to run in a second, and I don't know if I can.
Let this be the last point, and then we can all say goodbye. So there is a misconstrual of the relationship between commons and enclosures. There has to, like, Ostrom herself, David Harvey talk about the scalar limits of effective commons organizing. And what we said in our presentation was that there is aesthetic frictions at work in the aesthetic dimension of commons that are metaphorical enclosures. So there's two different things at work there. So I would defer to David Harvey and his point about the scalar limits. Ethan Miller also writes about the kind of misconstrual of enclosure as the counterpoint to commons in his PhD thesis. So I would also refer to him. He's worked closely with, the kind of leading heterodox economists in the field. So on that point, I would say thank you so much. I mean, I realize it was very dense and a bit of a whirlwind, but if anyone has any follow-up or wants to have any follow-up chats, that would be great. And thank